Welcome to the Viet Cinema Canon with host Anderson Lay. This is a sub-series of the Vietnamese podcast. You know, Tony Bui is a director that started out in the mid-90s. And when I was a student at USC, I went to go see Three Seasons twice. And it really inspired me.
His first film, right?
His first film, yeah. It really inspired me to go into film. And many of us, I wasn't the only one, there was a lot of us that, and I understand that he is a sort of somebody who really understands film, I mean, inside and out. And you had a conversation with Tony. Can you tell me why you chose Tony?
Well, I mean, again, the whole sub-series, the Viet Cinema Canon, what is that? We're exploring kind of what the filmmakers that helped shape this canon, basically our stories on on the big screen in movies and TV. And Tony is very much kind of like he's the benchmark. He's basically the guy. He's like who really opened up the floodgates, as especially in the '90s and whatnot. Very rare to see an Asian American director working. But like with Tony, he directed, wrote and directed Three Seasons, produced it with his brother Tim Bui, blew the doors open at Sundance. It got universal acclaim. Rarity to do the hat trick and won 3 awards.
Yeah, it really paved the way for all of us after.
Yeah. So exactly. So that inspired us. It was like Gen X or millennials who want to work in film, right? So Tony was the guy.
Yeah.
And Tony now, as a has transitioned this. He still is a filmmaker, but transitioned to as an educator. Now he's at Columbia University and teaching film, Asian film, Vietnamese film.
He doesn't give interviews. I mean, I've actually tried to get a few interviews with him a few times, and things haven't worked out. So you beat me to the punch, but join the conversation with Andy and Tony.
Really stoked to interview my friend Tony Bui. And before we start the conversation, I want to give a quick bio on Tony. Tony Bui is a Sundance award-winning writer, director, and producer. He is currently artist in residence at Columbia University in New York City at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and teaches at the school's arts graduate film program. His films include Yellow Lotus, Three Seasons, Green Dragon, and Throwaways. His short film Yellow Lotus was the first Vietnamese language film to be screened at the Sundance Film Festival and received over 15 national and international festival awards. His feature film debut, Three Seasons, was the first American-Vietnamese co-production to be filmed entirely in Vietnam. The film received the Grand Jury Prize, Audience Award, and Best Cinematography Award at the Sundance Film Festival, along with 2 Independent Spirit Award nominations. Three Seasons was also Vietnam's official entry to the Oscars, where it was shortlisted. In 2024, Three Seasons was brought back to Sundance and chosen as one of the 10 films from the festival's 4-decade history to celebrate its 40th anniversary. Tony is a recipient of the Humanitas Prize and an alumnus of the Sundance Institute's Screenwriting and Directing Labs. He has written and developed projects for HBO, Warner Brothers, and NBC. Tony previously was on the board of directors for Film Independent for 7 years and is currently at the Global Advisory Board of Fulbright University in Vietnam. As artist in residence in Columbia, Tony has brought filmmakers, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists, global activists, and more to the campus as guest speakers to engage in vital conversations about the role of artists and truth seekers. So, without further ado, let's have this conversation with Tony. Tony, how's it going, man?
It's great. It's cold here in New York City, but I'm warm here, so that's good. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, man. Thanks for being a part of this conversation series. It's really exciting. This is kind of was the impetus, the idea behind this series was to talk to filmmakers, especially in this very landmark year of just 2025, the 50th anniversary of the end of the American War in Vietnam. So I just wanted to revisit especially in your role at Columbia, just especially I think one of your mandates is to bring more Vietnamese into the arts on campus and whatnot in general, especially with your speaker series around the world, and what you do at Columbia, your role as an educator, and kind of like using kind of your film career as the syllabus, so to speak, in promoting that, right? So I think arts and culture is very important, especially when art is a reflective of the Vietnamese experience, and I think it's a very important tenet. So basically, when we start off with what you're growing up, I think you were born in Vietnam, and then you emigrated to the U.S., right? So, and then just I think you grew up in Northern California, and then just as a kid, what inspired you to what were some of the films that you watched that inspired you, and then kind of brought you along into making filmmaking your kind of your career, your call to work.
Yeah. So, like you said, I was born in Saigon, came here when I was just a baby. But, like many, Vietnamese refugee stories, we were spread out, our family spread out different parts of the country. Our, family, um, uh, ended up in Northern California, and both my parents ended up working in tech. And so the environment we grew up in my opinion, at least at the time, could not have been further away from anything to do with the arts, right? And especially, the way my upbringing was, you sort of, the way it involved the community. So a lot of it was around sort of anything I do with computers, math, all that kind of stuff. I mean, the people who were talked about in legends were people like Steve Jobs and these guys, right? And Steve Jobs actually went to a high school, different generation, of course, near where I went to high school. Um, but and growing up in a Vietnamese family, and at that time when we were growing up, there weren't a lot of Vietnamese families around us, right? I mean, obviously now San Jose is a important center for Vietnamese Americans, but at that time, we weren't living in San Jose at that time, and there just weren't a lot, and so it wasn't like I was around artists or filmmakers. That was not at all in the conversation. Not, something you don't even think about or dream of, because it's impossible for a young sort of Vietnamese American child to even think that that's a possibility. It's something, you go to movies, watch it. It's so distant, right? It wasn't like I even grew up in LA or anything like that. So I do think about how this all happened, because it is, in many ways I feel like it was, destined in some ways, but I hate using that word, but when I think back, it's hard to deny some of the moments, for me, at least the way I see it. And one of them was just, my dad was working for a company at that time called Memorex. Older people remember, that company,
Yeah.
and and he got laid off, and at that time he's trying to figure out what to do. And it was during the time when so there were sort of these video rental stores started to take off. So he decided to open one. And then he and my mom opened up another one, then another one. And, and it just took off. And at the height of it, I think they had like 5 video stores around Northern California. So, my brother and sister and I, we had, something like 10,000 movies, at our disposal that we can watch at any time. And we had to work at the video stores as well. So not only, so here I am, like at, 14, 15 years old, having to work at the video store, um, and basically catalog them, rent them out to the customers, and then of course, you're young, you're curious about them, and I mean, I spent all my time in the video stores and would bring them home, watch them. I didn't understand cinema at all. It wasn't like I was trying to seek out interesting films and filmmakers and all that. I was just absorbing a lot of films. So because of that, my early, film education came from all the very commercial, American Hollywood filmmakers like John Hughes. I watched all the John Hughes films, obviously, because I was young. So, Breakfast Club and all those from 16 Candles and I mean, of course, great ones like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, all that stuff. And then, I remember the first time I've been, other than of course Bruce Lee movies or Jackie Chan, like the first time I saw like Asians on screen in any kind of a cinematic way was when Last Emperor, came about, Bertolucci's film. and heck, that won the Oscar. And I was like, what's the Oscar? You know, I remember seeing The Last Emperor in the movie theater. It was the first film that I actually stayed for the credits. You know,
Yeah.
you know, when you're young, you watch, like, I don't care. Like, what, you know, other than, you know, I didn't even care who the director was. I cared even less. You know, what's a, you know, a key grip, you know, who's the cinematographer, who's the best boy, what were these different positions? It didn't matter to me. I just remember there was, like, you know, 1,000 names that would follow a film. It would bore the hell out of me, and I would leave before that. The Last Emperor was the first one that I actually stayed for all the credits. And so I started getting curious, you know, what it takes to make a film. Who are the players? You know, who holds these sort of creative choices? Again, I didn't understand about cinematography, but I understood enough to know that The Last Emperor stood out. You know, the way
Yeah.
he used his colors. At that time, I didn't know who Throwaways was and who shot the film or anything like that. But
Right.
you know, but the use of visual language, something that really, you know, affected me. And it was like, but again, it was more just out of curiosity. Never ever did I think it was something that could be a viable career choice. And it wasn't until I took a media class in high school where I started making short films with, like, you know, those big video cameras that, you know, we had back in the day that dad had, and I would edit by using two video decks, VCR
Right.
decks, and just like
Yeah.
record. And it was like super, you know, archaic, obviously, you know, analog. But my friends and I were able to make these, like, you know, mini horror films.
Yeah.
And and um and I think that's when it wasn't that I thought I can do it, but it was more like the bug, you know, sort of, was in me. And and there's something that I couldn't shake. And I just found tremendous joy in being able to express myself in this medium. And the other thing I wanted to add is I was just really, I was definitely an introvert, a shy kid. Um, you know, I was the president of my chess team, so I just told you everything. You know, where my social standing was in school.
Uh-huh.
Um, you know, and but I was incredibly fascinated by um, this thing called cinema. And I just started watching a lot of it. And fortunately, because of my parents' video stores, I had access to just, you know, I mean, probably over 10, 15,000 movies to watch. And
Were
so I
the,
started watching a whole lot more.
yeah, the video stores, were they for the Vietnamese community, or is it like
No, 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 no. We
they
didn't
were
have a
just
single
like kind of
Vietnamese
like,
title in there. It was all for
okay,
the American public. It was
okay,
like
yeah, yeah.
Santa Clara, Palo Alto,
Okay, got it.
Campbell. There was not a single, you know. And then we only wanted in San Jose, but no, it was all American titles.
Got
So
it.
you know, that was actually very, very. I mean, I don't think I saw a single Asian on screen
It wasn't like
until.
those. It wasn't those Hong Kong dubbed. I mean, Vietnamese dubbed Hong Kong TVB dramas that you would see in like
No, no, we didn't have
like,
those. No.
Condor Heroes or something like that, right? So it was
No,
like,
no, no, no. We didn't have those. You know, I know. I speak to
yeah,
some, you know, Vietnamese today about how you know, you never saw those, and I was like, I never did. You know, we didn't have those in the home or at the video store. But you
right.
know, I watched. I actually, other than Last Emperor, I remember when, um, oh my God, the one with Dennis Dunn and what's it
Oh,
called?
Big Trouble in Little China.
Big Trouble in Little China
Yeah, yeah,
blew
yeah,
my mind. You know,
yeah,
obviously it was a fun film, but Dennis Dunn, I was like, oh my God, there's an Asian in an
yeah,
American movie, you know,
yeah,
and I love Dennis Dunn. I got to work with him later on, you know, which was a huge honor. But I love Dennis Dunn because of that, you know,
yeah,
and
yeah.
he was like a hero to me because you know he was in Big Trouble in Little China,
Was
and
okay. Going back to like the Last Emperor, the first time. I mean, it must have been very impactful for you. Was that kind of your gateway drug? Like in the sense of like, wow, I'm seeing people who look like me on the big screen, and was that kind of like, okay, well, was that your film that was like, okay, well, maybe it kind of awoke in some kind of cinematic, like,
absolutely,
yeah, yeah. So
yeah.
I
I
mean,
mean,
that for me was definitely up there because I grew up in the
yeah,
'80s as well. That
yeah,
and Trouble in Little China was definitely one.
yeah,
So, yeah,
yeah.
but go ahead,
I
Sam.
mean, I mean, it was so bad even in those early films in the '80s when what was it? Oh my God, I'm gonna mess up the name now. Who was the Asian character in all in like that one John Hughes movie? You know, the Long Duck Dong or something like that, right?
Dong, yeah, yeah, and 16
Yeah, yeah.
Candles,
And
right?
everyone would
Yeah,
make fun of him, and it was
yeah,
super embarrassing, of course, to be Asian and have that, right? Because then
sure,
everyone makes fun of you and that. I was still fascinated. I was like, oh my God, he was just like, it's not even a real Asian character, but you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
But I was, and that's how bad the representation was for us. And,
Sure.
and so that when, a film like Last Emperor comes up, even though it was all in English and all that, I was still mesmerized by that.
Right.
It wasn't until I actually went to film school and started to watch, you know, films from obviously from China around the world that started to really, affect me in a big way. And I started to realize not only that I love cinema, wanted to do this, but then I started to realize my purpose, but that didn't come until later. I just was really just a kid fascinated by the ability to express oneself through
Uh-huh.
cinema, through the visual and cinematic language, and so I started seeking out what it meant to be a director and all that kind of stuff early on. But yeah, but it really came, really that change, that shift was because of these video stores that my parents had.
So so you were making these kind of backyard home, like little horror movies with your friends
Yeah.
and whatnot. But how did that kind of transition when you were post high school, going into university? What made you decide to basically? I mean, I assume you went to film school. I mean, you got a film degree. What made you decide to go pursue that?
I mean, it wasn't easy. So,
Versus like more of the practical thing of like accounting or tech or whatever. Like
yeah. So, and because, I did well in high school and, you know, aside from being the president of the chess team, I was also, in the math club, the math competitions, and I was good at it, very classic, so cliche Asian stuff.
sure.
Um, that was a thing, so my parents always thought I was going to go into engineering or tech or medicine or something, respectable like that. And I still recall when I told my parents I wanted to study film. And it wasn't even like I knew that I wanted to be a filmmaker. I just want to be around that energy, right? Because there's no way a Vietnamese kid growing up in Northern California in the '80s, you know, you know, can dream big enough to say that I want to be a film director one day, right? For me, it was just like I want to be in that environment. I don't know what, you know, I mean, of course, in my heart, I want to do that, but it's one of those things where you're just unsure. But I wanted to go to film school and explore and be around that energy, right? And I told my parents, and I remember like they were incredibly unhappy about it. My mom, had a pretty much like a breakdown, and did everything they could to try to convince me not to go down that path. Everything from one to send me to go visit my cousin, who was already a doctor at the time, to um, basically they thought it was a phase, and if I can just experience or be in contact with people who did really well in the fields that they wanted me to go into, that I would shake off this passing teenage obsession, but I didn't, to basically to their disappointment. And I remember a car ride. This was a very important car ride. I remember my dad was uh, stoic military man, did not wasn't the kind of person that would take you out and have long conversations with you. He asked me to go for a car ride, and and that was I was like 16 or 17 years old or something, and just that alone freaked me out because he would never do that. I said, where are we going? He's like, it didn't matter. Just drive north towards San Francisco, which is very scary. I knew it was going to be a difficult conversation. So, and I had to do the driving. So he sat in the passenger seat, and he just started asking me all these questions like, why do you want to go to film school? You know, um, you know, what if you don't make it? The chance of making is very, it's gonna be very slim. And and I remember just answering all the questions, but it's passion, love. I feel being drawn to this, and I remember, he's like, "You're not going to make any money," and I said, it didn't matter. So I'm not doing this for the money. And I remember saying, even if I'm broke and I'm poor, but I'm doing what I love, and that's what only that matters to me. And I remember him saying this, and he goes, can you point to one Vietnamese person that has made films and made it in America, as a filmmaker? And I could not, in a sense, sort of my generation, we were going to be the first to do it,
Yeah.
and I could not. And he said, okay, can you point to, one non-Vietnamese, any Asian that comes from our region or area who's gone out to make a film and has made it in Hollywood? And I could not, and even the film that influenced me, that Thousand Age film was made by an Italian director,
Okay.
Bernardo Bertolucci, right? So I could not. And then he said, okay, can you just point to not one Vietnamese, not one Asian. You can point to just one American, any white American that you know of in that region. I'm sure there was, but I didn't know anybody. I could not point to anyone. Of course, Lucas came from there, but I didn't know, so I was like, I cannot. He was like, point to any one person, that you know of or heard of who came from the Bay Area, anything. I could not. So basically, I could not point to a single person. So he says, then why do you think you can make it? And so I just had to answer that, I don't know if I can make it, but I know it's something that's in my heart, that something that I didn't know at that point. The passion was so great in me that I didn't know how to live without it, and that's what I expressed to my dad. And so it wasn't about trying to make it or make money. I didn't know what making it even meant, but I just knew it was something that I had to do, and it was a form of expression that I wanted to be a part of. And I remember he got really quiet. He was like, "Okay, I've heard enough. Turn the car around. Let's try it back." He didn't say a single word on the way back. It was absolutely silent. But I knew I got him, and he allowed me to go to film school, and he was okay with it. But that was him. And he got home, and clearly it was a conversation that my mom probably made him go do, and he did not succeed in convincing me not to go to film school. So I could, I could imagine what my mom probably said to him when he got back, and it's like, oh, let's let him do this. He convinced me. My mom was like, you had one job, and you failed at it. So my mom for the next like 2-3 years continued to try to convince me to stop going to film school. And I remember, like, I was a junior. She was like, if you wanted to, go back to engineering school, you can, and we would, pay for it all over again. Just don't go to study film. And I say go back to engineering school because one of the things I did was I tried to make it unclear whether I was going to film school at the start. And I said, well, maybe I'll go, but I'll study engineering. But they were so busy with their business and work, they never actually followed, paid attention to what I was doing. But I was actually just going to film school, even though I was, alluding to the fact that I might have been going to engineering school, So that's how it started. But when I got to film school, I know there's a lot of debate whether film school is necessary or not, and every individual is different. Their background and trajectory is different. For me, it was an absolutely game-changing moment in my life. And the time I was in film school, for me, it was like an oasis. I got to. Oh, by the way, it wasn't just my parents. Everyone in my life told me not to do it. My high school friends, my high school counselor said it was the worst mistake of my life because he was like, "Oh, you're doing well in school. You should." And all my friends that I'm going to, like, I grew up in the Bay Area, so my friends all went to like Berkeley or Stanford or other schools, and they went to technology and all that. Every single person in my life said it was a mistake. I honestly can't pinpoint one person who thought it was a good idea to leave and go to film school. And when I went, I was the only Vietnamese kid in there. And later on, there was another one came. Some others came, but at that time there was no one. And but it was an absolute dream, an amazing time period of my life to go to film school, because basically all I did 24/7 was eat, drink, sleep, film. I watched it. We obviously had to study it, and then I took a job as a projectionist, and that was a game changer for me. And so I lived out my own cinema paradiso, and I basically was this kid. So not only did I study these films, I had to project them for all the other classes as well. So all the great, European classics, I got to, the Italian neorealists, the French New Wave, the Chinese fifth generation filmmakers. Not only did I get to study these films, I got to project them over and over and over again for other classes. I got to watch like these films multiple times, throughout the semester. And it was absolutely the most beautiful, amazing time period of my life. And I'll have to say, for the younger generation who might be watching this, I projected them all on celluloid, which was like amazing. So they would come in reels, big canisters. I have to like clean them, put the little dots on them for the gate. We do this thing called the changeover, which no one, most people who watch this, unless you're projections, probably won't understand. And then and then we would have to thread them, and then once they were done, clean them, put them all back in the canisters, ship them back. So but when you're like 18, 19, 20 and all that, it was I basically lived in a projection booth when I wasn't in class or working on film sets.
Well, I think it's like, I think back in like 80s and 90s, going to film school, being a projectionist, like just being in cinema in general, like it's like, the entry point was like more difficult because it's on celluloid right now. It's like analog. now, like anyone can be technically making movies on their iPhone, like it's completely changed, so I think there's a romanticism in film, and I think that's kind of lost in the kind of like the whole and then at the same time it's in the whole digital revolution, but at the same time it's leveled the playing field, so to speak. But there's good and bad things about it. But anyway, going to film school, whatnot. Yellow Lotus was it your graduate? Was it a
It was
graduate?
like my. I mean, I went to film school as an undergrad, so it was my undergraduate thesis to graduate.
Undergraduate thesis, yeah. So
Yeah.
Vietnamese story, but you didn't film it in Vietnam, right? You filmed it.
Yellow Lotus, the whole thing.
Oh no, you're right. You did. You did film it in Vietnam. That's right. Yeah. That's right. So Yellow Lotus in 3 seasons. It was a short film, and then your feature film. Both filmed in Vietnam. They're Vietnamese stories. I mean, you're basically the first American production back in Vietnam. Post after the war. Maybe briefly just talk about those experiences of going. I mean, was it a lot of escape? Was it a lot of like, how did you kind of like convince, say, the government to allow you to go shoot in Vietnam, employ Vietnamese, cast and crew and whatnot?
Absolutely. To make sense of that, I'm going to backtrack.
Okay.
Like 1 or 2 years, real quick, and I'll answer a previous question you had. So, even though I was born in Vietnam, I'd never been, but I was left when I was so young that I had obviously no memory of being there.
Yeah.
Right, my earliest memories are in America, and I was already in film school when I went to Vietnam for the first time at the age of 19. So I went with my dad, and it was one of those things where I was curious about the country, but I wasn't sure if I really wanted to go. But obviously, I wasn't. But I was like, okay, I'll go, and I remember so clearly when the plane landed, and at that time when the plane landed, everyone would clap, right? Because it was just one of those like emotional things. So many Vietnamese were coming back to Vietnam at that time in the 90s, and I remember like the cabin doors opening and all this humidity and heat hit me, and I was already like, oh, this is gonna be awful. I remember thinking, I remember thinking very clearly, if I had a magic button, I would press and go right back to California, because I was like that. We grew up in the suburbs of California, and obviously, did not experience any of this, and I was basically,
cool weather, dry weather, like in Northern California. Yeah.
So and then we go, and I get to see my grandparents and uncles and cousins and all that, for the first time, and it was. It wasn't a immediately emotional experience. It wasn't like, oh my God, it was almost like an awkward experience. I didn't really know them, and obviously Vietnam that time in the mid '90s was, was underdeveloped because of so many, decades of war, and it was a difficult place to be. And so I remember getting bitten by mosquitoes all the time, and just having, a lot of problems because, not familiar with the food, and just having a lot of health issues and all that. And I remember just not really liking it, right? And at one point I asked my dad if I could just cut this. It was only a 2-week trip. I can cut it short and go back. And he's like, no, you can't do that. He ended up putting me. I was staying at my grandmother's house, and I just felt so uncomfortable. And my guy ended up putting me in a hotel, which made it a little bit better. But by the time I left, I was ready to leave. But something happened, and this was another turning point that really changed my life. I remember when I was about to leave, I started to cry. I didn't understand why, because the entire 2 weeks I was miserable. I just wanted to leave. I want to go back to California. I was like, this is not for me, and all that kind of stuff. But I started to cry, and the whole plane trip home, I felt this incredibly, I felt this emptiness start to form, and I didn't understand why, but clearly something was connecting me with the country and the people, even in a subconscious way. And after that trip, I started to seek out everything I could about Vietnam, and I would watch videotapes and documentaries, and it would change the books I would read, the films I would watch, and the next opportunity I got to go back, I took it right away. And this time I would start visiting the bookstores and the libraries, and this something happened and I know, thinking back, I know more clearly now, but at that time I didn't. And this is why I believe in the importance of representation so much, is that going into the bookstore, I saw every face in the magazine, the books looked Vietnamese. And that's something that I never experienced in America, right? If you're a child growing in America, you look different, and you go in and you go into, a bookstore, and the magazine rack is basically all white faces, or, occasional sort of African American face or Latino face, but you'll never see an Asian face, right? Except for one or the other person that had an impact when I was young. Um, uh, um, yeah, was the character in oh my god, I don't know why I'm blanking right now. Um, Indiana Jones.
Oh yeah, Ke
Uh,
Huy Quan, Short Round.
yeah, Ke Quan. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And just seeing him on there was, and then at one point he was on the front page of Tiger Beat or something like that, and it blew my mind. And I was like, oh my god, yeah, not only an Asian, but he was also a refugee from Vietnam. It was such a but being in Vietnam and driving, going down the street and seeing every face on the billboards be Vietnamese, and seeing all the magazines have Vietnamese faces, and on television all Vietnamese faces, it had this tremendous effect on me. It confused me because I did not grow up like that, and I wasn't one of those kids growing up, thinking, oh, there isn't a Vietnamese face on these these American magazines. Something is really wrong. I just accepted it as the norm, but I realized that wasn't the norm, at least for you know, in every part of the world. And in Vietnam, the norm is to have people look like me on there. And it was such a an aha moment, a moment of clarity for me. And so when I went go back to college, it changed everything for me, and it changed the trajectory of the kind of films I want to make as well. So Yellow Lotus was born out of that. So because when I went to film school, I thought I was going to be making, honestly, like other kinds of movies,
Sure.
and I wasn't interested in telling the Vietnamese experience, or Vietnamese American experience at all. I didn't even know that you can express that,
Yeah.
and 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 these trips in Vietnam changed that. And so Yellows was born out of that. And also, just add one thing, in the mid-90s was a period of Doi Mai, and so
Yeah.
basically Vietnam and America started to reconcile,
Right.
and diplomatic relations were renewed by President Clinton at the time in 1995. So, and we opened up our embassy again, and so there was this huge change socially and economically in Vietnam, and I happened to experience that firsthand. And Yellow Lotus, was a film about that change, but through the eyes of the Vietnamese people. And yeah, so, and that became the precursor to 3 Seasons.
Yeah, 3 Seasons. But I call like it did the unprecedented hat trick at Sundance where it won 3 awards. Like it was like this was 1999, I think.
Yeah.
Sundance 99.
Yeah.
So the grand jury prize, the audience award, and best cinematography, right? So I mean, the fact that you did this, and it was a desert when it comes to Asian representation, in films, just like really quickly that experience. This is kind of like in the heyday of Sundance, when especially in the 90s when there was like this boom of like the independent film scene, and Sundance was getting all this recognition from like think of Soderberghs and the Tarantinos and the Robert Rodriguez and Allison Anders and all, and et cetera, right? So talk about kind of like just that experience really quickly.
It was obviously a very emotional experience. So I just want to add in there real quick that my brother Timothy Bui also worked on Yellow Lotus with me, so when we went to Sundance, and he worked on 3 Seasons with me. In fact, when he worked on Yellow Lotus, it was actually his first time back to Vietnam. Like I had gone, several times already,
Right.
and he was maybe more hesitant than me to go. But when I finally made Yellow Lotus, he came back to help me produce that. And I just answer your question earlier about difficulty of getting the government approval. It was difficult at that time. The infrastructure to make films was still very minimal at the time. And so basically, I brought my crew from America. Even on my short film Yellow Lotus, I brought a lot of students from my film school, and And I brought someone who later on would make his films. I want to give a shout out to, because of there's an emotional connection for a lot of us Vietnamese American. That's Stefan, Gauger, and I remember connecting with them. And when I met Yellow Lotus, I was like 20 years old, and he was like maybe 23, and he came in and worked as my gaffer. And so those early members were very special. And Stefan obviously went out to make a lot of special films in Vietnam, and I
Shout out
mentioned
to
that because we
Owl and the Sparrow, especially, so.
yeah,
But rest in peace,
yeah.
Stefan. So
Exactly. So Stepan was part of that original, crew, that made Yellow Lotus with us, and we all went to Sundance together, and it was very special. Again, there's not a single other Vietnamese person. There's very few Asians at the time. I remember, and I said this in other interviews and stuff, but it was so rare to see an Asian at Sundance at the time that if you were to see one at a park across the street, you would like, oh my god, like gravitate towards each other and talk, and like, oh my god, there's another Asian, can't believe it,
Yeah.
and we've come a long way, thankfully, and but it took a long time to come this far. But anyway, so so getting approval in Vietnam was difficult. If you want to shoot in Vietnam, you have to go through many different steps, the Bureau of Cinema, Ministry of Culture, and go up and get approval from from the government, and then there's a censor officer with you on set at all times. So when you shoot, make sure you stick to the script, only the script. So it was difficult, but we we did it. And something that we were, it wasn't one of those things where we thought like we were trailblazing and everything like that. It was just making films so tough, and at that time you're so young. You just I just had a really passionate story that I wanted to tell about Vietnam at that time period, and wanted to represent the Vietnamese people in a way that I thought had not been represented in film and media at that time, and still rarely. In a way that was rarely done. And and when you ask me about shooting in Vietnam, I want to make a point about that. I don't want to skip over that quickly because that was an important criteria for me. So when I made Yellow Lotus and 3 Seasons, there were 3 things I really wanted to make sure would happen because I had watched so many films about Vietnam, these American war films, Apocalypse Now, Platoon, all these other films, and none of them shot on the actual soil of Vietnam.
Right.
And a lot of them, used Thai actors, Filipino actors, and basically said they were Vietnamese and pretended to speak Vietnamese. It was basically just gibberish.
Yeah.
But they pretended to speak Vietnamese, and I'm sure the producers were like, "Oh, it's good enough," and so long as it sounds Asian, no one cares, that kind of stuff, right? So when I set out to do Yellow Lotus in 3 Seasons, it was important to me to shoot on the actual soil of Vietnam, right? So both films entirely shot in Vietnam. 2, to use real Vietnamese people, Vietnamese actors, and that was very important for me. And then 3rd, to have real Vietnamese dialogue, to have real Vietnamese spoken in these films, and not just pretend Vietnamese or words or sounds somewhat Vietnamese phonetically but weren't really Vietnamese, that kind of stuff. So anyways, that was important for me at that time, even back when I was making Yellow Lotus.
So yeah, I mean, 3 Seasons again, just made such a impact at Sundance, and it's pretty much hallowed in Sundance history. But this was like kind of before, a few years before Better Luck Tomorrow with Justin Lin. Before now you see this like before even Crazy Rich Asians. Before now you see Shang-Chi or whatever. Like you see now more representation. Ke Huy Quan coming back into the fold with Everything Everywhere All at Once and winning an Oscar, so and so and that's like fast forward like 20 plus years now, and just like with 3 Seasons, I mean Sundance brought it back, and like and you meticulously went through kind of like the restoration process of just basically just updating the film look into this 4K restoration, and now it's been again bring back to Sundance. It's played at various film festivals and cinematheques around the world. People are rediscovering 3 Seasons, and which is fantastic. And then now kind of your role now as a artist in residence at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia. Like now, and just what I mean, what did I mean? Just like your work there as essentially an educator. How do you see now? Such I'm sure that your student body, there's a lot of students of Asian descent, and also non-Asian descent, obviously. And then how are you, your curriculum of 3 seasons, your work with 3 seasons, and all your other work, but also with kind of like Asian global cinema. What is their kind of reaction when it comes? I think these are Gen Z students, right? So, what do you think how they are consuming or learning about kind of Asian cinema versus you as a Gen X or millennial back in the day, and what their reactions, what their their reactions were, back in the 90s and early 2000s when it comes to consuming kind of.
Yeah. There's a lot to say with all that. So I'll rewind real quick and just talk about 3 seasons at Sundance. I'll start there because I didn't really fully answer that question for you earlier. It's just we obviously made the film. It was a film with a passion. It was a story that was important, for me to tell about what was going on in Vietnam at that time period. It was a film that were the heroes of the story were people who were most often overlooked in Vietnam and
Right.
were in the newspapers, weren't covered in most of the conversations at that time. Vietnam was going through this huge change again. I said because of the um, uh, the Doi Mai and sort of the American and Vietnam coming back together again, and economically and diplomatically, and a lot of the winners of the stories were obviously the politician, the businessmen, people who, the movers and shakers, decision makers. But the time that I spent in Vietnam, I spent a lot of time with the people who were affected by these decisions, but were not the people who had much of a say in it. So anyway, so 3 seasons was a representation of these people. And there's sort of some lyricism in it, and sort of it's a metaphor to some other things, that's going on in the country at that time. So that was important to me. But of course, in America, we come there and, we had no expectation at Sundance because, at that a film like that is rare, was never a film like that was never seen at Sundance. So when it won those awards, it was such it obviously was an emotional and beautiful moment, but it was so overwhelming, confusing that I remember just thinking back at that time. I don't think there was much joy. It was just more like confusion, and then but that was really sick because it was Sundance, and you always get sick when you go there, and but also a feeling of responsibility of, okay, this had to happen for a reason, and how do I take this and move it forward in a way that allows for more films like this can get made. And sometimes I say, it's a film that won its awards at the wrong time, because that time in 1999, I remember after making this film trying to go out and make more films like that, and every single studio that I met and every single meeting I had with producers were like, oh, that was an experiment that worked. We don't want to do something like that again. And every script I got was basically, stories of, where there was a single Asian in there, not even Vietnamese. There was a single Asian in the story. It was basically, all the heroes and protagonists and all the characters were all basically white, and and they basically were sending me these scripts and saying, we took a chance on one Vietnamese film. It made money, thankfully, won awards, but you have this ability. Let's make films that people actually want to see. You know what I mean? So so it was a very difficult journey in at the start, and like you said earlier, Better Luck Tomorrow didn't come to a few years later, and then the big wave of Asian cinema didn't come to like 20 years later. So literally every single meeting, they did not want to duplicate anything that we tried to do with 3 seasons. So it was
Right.
really odd and difficult journey. So there was this high, this immediate low, because you realize the reality of the situation, that they basically said this was a one-off. Now go do something else. So we had to deal with that. So because of that, the film when it came out, was shown on celluloid, right? It was shot in 35 millimeter. It was projected in the theaters on celluloid. But because of this, because it came just a couple years before the switch to digital
Digital.
for the
Yeah.
film. Yeah, the film never was remastered into a digital format. It was never transferred, so it basically just existed in celluloid for the next 20 years. And eventually, streaming came, and the film, if it needed to be shown, had to be projected. So the
Yeah.
chance for it
I
to
mean,
be
there's also
seen,
rights issues and whatnot.
all
Companies come
kinds of
and go.
issues. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it existed only on celluloid and eventually disappeared.
Yeah.
I mean, the film could not be streamed or seen anywhere. Everyone would ask me, well, how do I see the film? And I was like, there's not, you really could not, except for, there was a couple of DVDs made. I think one out of, I think it was basically a company out of Korea. We had no oversight into that. I think the rights were sold. Someone made a really bad,
Yeah.
DVD copy. And that was what was sold on Amazon. And that's what, most, educators and libraries use to see the, teach the film or show the film. But I have a copy of it, and it's a really bad transfer, and the subtitles aren't even correct. It's all these mistakes in the subtitles. But again, because there was also Korean subtitles in there as well, but it was originally made for Korean audience, made for Korean audience. So that was the best we can get. And then someone had uploaded a version of that to YouTube, so some scratchy, really bad version. That's the only way to watch the film, until last year. And just to talk about the restoration, I was very fortunate that, Sundance had their 40th anniversary and selected 10 films to represent the 40 years, and 3 seasons got picked as one of them. So because it was called back, but there was no way to show it. And John 9 at Sundance is basically like, the film has to be, there has to be a digital version for us to show it, because times have changed. You can't project it at 35 millimeter print. And we had prints of it, of course.
Right.
And so then now it was a mad rush to make that happen. And Jason Cleo, and was one of the producers on it, and Joanna Vicente as well. But Jason Cleo worked with me to now restore the film. And we had a very short amount of time to do this. But basically, we had to raise the money and make it all happen. And basically, Sundance was like, if you can't hit these benchmarks along the way, we're gonna have to drop it, because we can't announce it and not be at Sundance, right?
Yeah.
And I can say this now, Jason and I would every step of the way would tell Sundance, of course we can get it done. No, it's all set. No, we have the financing. Everything is there. We did not, but we just believed that we could. But we had to. It's one of those things where we believed it would happen, and then move forward as it would, and just hope that everything would fall into place. And the film, and it was very, very difficult. And I want to give a quick shout out to some people, because without them it could not have happened. One of them was Professor Lin Hung at the Weatherhead Institute. She stepped in to help with the financing for the restoration, including a Columbia alumni named Peter Mack, who's an amazing individual, and he stepped in. And then we were able to they helped me write a letter, and then it was sent out to a bunch of different donors, and we were able to raise the money to get the financing of the restoration done. And the money wasn't been raised until December. The festival of Sundance is in January, so work already started. And we did not know how we were going to fund this. And thankfully the labs did it, because they knew the film. Some had already watched the film and really and were fans of the film, so they did it believing that we could find the money, right? And because and it was already word that Sundance wanted to program it, and I think John and I spoke to the lab and all that, so they knew it was at least they felt like we were good for it. So they started the process. We had no idea, because we told everyone, oh yeah, the money's coming. We did not get the money until mid-December. It was incredibly there was a lot of sleepless nights,
Yeah. Down to the wire. Yeah.
It was down to the wire, and we did not finish the film until I think 5 days before the festival started. Of course,
Crazy.
but it was absolutely crazy. And but we got it done, and because we got it done, the film was restored to 4K. And so basically, the restoration process is, Oh, one more thing, I have to add this, because it was such a long period of time in which no one had actually went to go, basically find and see the negative. That when this process started, we had to find the negative, find the sound elements to make sure they were of decent enough quality that it can even be restored in time because we had such a short
Right.
amount of time. We basically did something that would take 6 months in like 6 weeks, basically. You know,
Yeah.
that in the beginning we couldn't even find the materials. You know, and there was this whole thing where we weren't sure what the negative was, and we weren't sure where the sound elements, you know, were located. And we were extremely nervous. And I was like, how in the world did you lose negative to my film, you know, the labs? And eventually it was found, but it took several weeks and it was just basically mislabeled, you know, but eventually found and the process was able to start. And we did it was just it was a very nerve-wracking, but also very important process because one, obviously I got to remaster my film. Now it exists in 4K. Now it was able to play at Sundance. And like you said, I had an amazing run in 2024. I played the Lincoln Center, Smithsonian, a bunch of different festivals, and I played all over the world actually, and still continues to play. You know, it'll be many different schools. It's playing at NYU Tisch actually this coming Friday. I don't know when this comes out. Probably, you know, this podcast will come out
later, but
later already. Yeah, but it comes out Tisch. It'll play at Princeton. It's going to play at Asian side of New York City. So it's still having its run, and which is pretty amazing. And you know, people are still reaching out. But I can only do this now because we have this 4K restoration, which which didn't exist before.
Versus showing the kind of like badly transferred green DVD, like it's like
exactly, and that's how schools did it before. You know, or they would show because because now it's really hard to project 35mm prints. You know,
it is,
yeah. But it also made me aware of the importance of the restoration process,
absolutely,
preserving films and preserving our identity and our stories. And in the end, that's what this is. This isn't actually about preserving films. This is about preserving our stories, and that's why these films, whether it's mine or anyone else's, it's important not only in the preservation part of it, but we also have to make sure the next generation of storytellers and filmmakers get a chance to even tell these stories in the first place so that they can be preserved. And that's really important. And then that I'll put it to my time at Columbia. And that's why, you know, I decided to step into the World Academia and accept this position to be artist in residence is to bring all this knowledge and experience that I have and basically help the next generation of storytellers and bring more of these stories to Columbia and other schools in a way that wasn't there when I was in film school and when I was going through college.
I mean, like, just like looking back, like, university for you was so formative when you were watching, like basically, just like works from Zhang Yimou or Wong Kar-wai or you name it, or Akira Kurosawa. Like, how is it now as you teaching basically kids, young students in their 20s who are who look like you and me, of Asian descent, and kind of like, how do you see the way that they are watching or consuming films differently?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. First, access, right? When I watched all those, films from Asia at the time when I was in film school, we knew how to watch it as prints, right?
Yeah.
Or, I mean, there was like, some like VHS. I remember like going to like the video store, at that time I was in LA. So there's, art house video stores you can go to and get some of these, you watch it that way as well.
Sure.
Otherwise it's prints or VHS. And then of course DVDs would come, and at that time there was no streaming yet. So the accessibility of it, access is everything, right? If you don't have access to something, it doesn't matter if the content's out there, you can't even watch it, right? So representation is important. You got to get it made first, but then access is important, right? So both are important. And so where it's changed is the access to this content, to these films, to these stories. It's more widely available. So a lot of the kids now growing up who love cinema or who are Asian descent, they can watch all these films, and now you can just press a couple buttons on your computer and just have it streamed by your computer, watch it. I hope they're not watching their computers. I hope they're watching it on some big screen at their homes, at least on their big TV sets. But you know what I mean. And but so I think their connection to these stories are different. We still have a long ways to go. So I don't think anyone is saying, oh, there's we have amazing representation and we don't have to worry about it and all that. I think the need for representation and for Vietnamese storytelling, absolutely. Asian storytelling, of course, Asian American storytelling is still there. But it's different in that I think kids today have others to look to be able to say that, oh, this is possible, that we can do this as a career, and that oh, we want to be like that person, make films like make these kinds of films, and I think that gap has diminished greatly, and the leap from being an engineer or a medical student, or as most Asians are pushed into, to becoming an artist, that leap is getting smaller and smaller, and that's a good thing.
Well, like just and then just one of the reasons the inspiration for this talking, for this series, is basically just to reflect that this year 2025 is an anniversary year. It's the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War, essentially. It's so just wanted to, and then kind of folds into your work at Columbia, and what you're doing, especially for this year, and maybe talk about kind of your goals personally to see more, not only Asian but Vietnamese representation in the arts, and bringing them on campus, but also what your kind of the special project you're personally working on uh, uh, at Columbia, with your, I think is it the 50/30 thing?
Yeah.
Also what you're doing, what you're kind of curating for Criterion Channel. So
Yeah, absolutely.
that way, yeah.
Absolutely. So I just want to add one thing real quick, because as I'm saying all this stuff, I don't want to, because I'm just throwing my mom under the bus, because all that early conflict with her actually helped me, because it forced me to really understand why I wanted to be a filmmaker. Right? Sometimes
Yeah.
I had to really fight for it at every single stage, every level. And at that time, I was so bitter about it that I realized that it forced me to be a better storyteller, better filmmaker, better artist, because it made me really in tune with what I wanted. When you have to fight for something,
Sure.
it sharpens you and sharpens that journey, and it helps solidify that purpose more. I don't think I would have been the same artist if the obstacles were not there. I'm not saying it should always be there, but I just want to put that out there. And the funny thing is, obviously, later on, when my mom realized that I can make a living out of it, and that's something that I gained success with. Even Yellow Lotus winning a lot of awards and Sundance and onward, my mom became accepting of it. And then the true full circle moment was when my mom one day called me, and she was like, "Oh, by the way, I was thinking about being a screenwriter, kid, and I had this idea for a screenplay, and I want to write a screenplay. If I write a screenplay, will you read it?" I thought it was just such a funny moment from her not wanting to be a filmmaker to then that her wanting to be a screenwriter and make
That's
films herself. So it's such a classic moment. And but
well, again, that comes full circle, because she didn't see films with basically a reflection of her or the music experience and whatnot, and maybe the fact that her son is making these films that are winning awards and whatnot. So that kind of sparked that. It's just like you have to wrap your brain around things, like it's like you don't see it in front of you, you can't fathom it. Like it's like
exactly.
Yeah.
So it basically, she went from seeing something as an impossibility, to seeing that it's possible, and that's her arc through this, right? And that's it. So that's why I don't blame her. At that time when you're young, of course, you're really angry. It's like, you don't understand me, and all that stuff that teenagers do and all that. But obviously, it's just that she didn't. She grew up in during wartime, lost everything. Was a refugee, came and had to rebuild everything.
Yeah.
She's so for her, it's all about safety, about making sure you do things that that makes things possible for you in a way that she did not have, right?
Yeah,
So
it's something that's risk averse, risk averse and all that stuff. Yeah, so
exactly. But that's why, again, representation is important, right? She saw me go through this, and now she thought this thing again that was impossible to do is possible, and she changed her mind simply because you're able to see someone else do it, right? And you're able to see someone that representation. So anyway, that's why it's important. You don't know who you're affecting, but there's always someone who's going to be watching quietly, whose lives would his life will be changed because of their representation. That's why it's important. Okay, so get to about Colombia. Yeah, so it's been an amazing journey. I had been invited to be at Colombia in earlier years, and I always thought, oh, it's not something I want to do. I want to just be an artist, make films, and all that. But this opportunity came not only to teach, but also to be an artist in residence. So I thought, I could have more impact, and it was a great combination. And yeah, so I'm artist in residence at the Weatherhead Institute, and also the institute, which has been around in Colombia for 75 years, and is to promote a better understanding with East Asia. And it came after World War II, and people not understanding that much about China and Japan. So Colombia, with some funding, created this institute at that time to really focus on creating scholars who would be able to better advise policy and other educators about this region of the world. But it focused mostly on China, Japan, obviously, because the Cold War,
Yeah.
and those are the major players at the time. And then later on, of course, Taiwan, Korea, of course, by the 1950s and all that. But Southeast Asia was left out of it for decades until very recently. And Professor Lin Hong is actually the first director of the Institute of Southeast Asian descent, and obviously the first Vietnamese. So that made a difference for me coming there as well. So I work at the Institute, and we try to do, and pretty much everyone at the Institute is in other fields, of course, in a lot of the history, economics, and all that. And I'm the artist in residence there. So I try to bring a lot of artists and thinkers and creators to Colombia to speak from the vantage point of either Asians or or Asian Americans. And we do a lot of work in Asia as well. So because I'm a filmmaker, so my focus is storytelling, and so we try to connect with and a lot of storytellers and filmmakers across Asia, and through programming, through talks, by bringing authors to Colombia for talks, or us going out and reaching out to and supporting artists in other countries. And then also I teach at Columbia, and I teach filmmaking in the grad program, and I try to focus my teaching along these lines as well. So I teach a class called International Filmmaking. We look at why films, films that are regionally made, and so we examine how they can maintain their authenticity regionally, they still have a global impact.
Yeah.
And we look at a lot of films, and so a lot of my students are grad students who are preparing to make their film and shoot overseas as well.
Sure.
And I teach another class called the Vietnam War in Cinema. There's a class that means a lot to me, and it's a look at the Vietnam War through American cinema and Vietnamese cinema. And this is where it gets, the Vietnamese cinema part is where it's different, because of course the American cinema part is well known in America. We all know films like Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now, and Platoon, and Full Metal Jacket, and all that. But I realized a lot of how Americans think about Vietnam was shaped by these films. No one's ever seen the films from the Vietnamese side. How do the Vietnamese portray themselves in this war? Obviously, here we call it the Vietnam War, and in Vietnam they call it the American War, right? So that was really fascinating to me. So I teach that class, and so I pair up these films based on themes, and we discuss these things. And it's always I always get such amazing conversations from the students from this, and so I do that, and yeah, so it's an and I joined Columbia and Weatherhead as artists in residence at a very unique time, because, as you mentioned earlier, this year is the 50-30. 50-30 means 50th anniversary of the end of the war, and 30th anniversary of reconciliation, which is 1995. Right, when I was saying earlier with America and Vietnam renewing their diplomatic ties, so it's a celebration of both. And so there's a lot of, and Columbia has, the largest sort of Vietnam studies program of any college in America. And we have several Vietnamese PhDs here in history, and which is amazing. And so we have a lot of programming that we're doing to to commemorate those two milestones. And and from a historical perspective to political perspective, and what I'm doing for these events is trying to bring an arts and culture perspective. and to see where we're at now, 50 years later, since the end of the war, and 30 years later since since reconciliation. So this is important, and it's important because we're obviously a place of higher learning, and so we try to create conversations that have not only impact for our students, but have national and international impact as well. So we have a lot of very interesting people coming, to have these conversations. And we've done a little bit of this throughout the last year and a half that I've been, artist in residence, where we will have these thinkers and scholars come and give talks. So we're building up to our 50/30. And of course, my whole thing again is storytelling in film. So that's I take it from that perspective, which I think a lot of times people think, oh, it's film, it's not as important. I think it's incredibly important. You're in this field, Anderson, so because whether you're as artists, what do? We are basically collecting the stories of our people, and these stories are the stories that will, when someone 100 years from now, 200 years now, they look back and see the Vietnamese people during this time period, or Asians during this time period. It's going to be through these stories, right? It's going to be through our collective art, and that's why storytelling has such a. I always like to say storytelling instead of just filmmaking, because
Yeah.
it's more, it penetrates people a little bit more. It helps
Sure.
people understand
Yeah.
what this means more.
Yeah.
Because when people say, if we say film, people, they think entertainment, they think all that other stuff. But the filmmaking is more than just entertaining us. It can teach us, educate us, it can represent us in so many different, in important ways. And so we, through the work I'm trying to do is try to create more representation of these stories, and try to help foster in the next generation of storytellers and filmmakers. That was a very long answer. There's many different parts, because it's kind of a big question you asked. And then to answer the last part where you're asking about Criterion, so I've been very, it's a big honor to be asked to curate this program. Lisa Ma was the head of programming at Criterion. I met her at the Udine Film Festival. We got into a conversation about it, and she, I told her what I teach at Columbia, and she thought it was really fascinating. And she was like, "Oh, well, and then let's put together a program to commemorate the 50th anniversary, where basically we're going to do a Criterion, what I'm doing in my class, where so I'm going to curate basically 6 or 7 American films, and have them be part of a program alongside 6 or 7 Vietnamese films. And I'm going to do it by theme as well. So one's going to be like soldiers on the battlefield, one's going to be women in war, one's going to be on the home front, morality in war. So different themes, and then see how American films, dealt with these themes, and then how Vietnamese films dealt with these themes. And sometimes they're similar, right? Because the human experience is often very similar. But because depending on which side you're on, the reasons why each side went into to the war was different. The way the different countries and filmmakers handle the themes are vastly different, and that's unique to talk about. So I'm basically taking what I do at Columbia in my class and putting it onto Criterion, and hopefully a lot of people will get to see the Vietnamese side, the Vietnamese perspective of the war, and in a way, it's gonna be alongside really famous films like Full Metal Jacket, Platoon, and stuff like that, which is, which hasn't been done before, and I'm excited by it. We're gonna do conversations and lead-ins to give context. So we're not just dumping the films on the Criterion, but we're gonna give some context of why these films are chosen,
Right.
and the impact, and what these themes mean. And so it's gonna be released in April, and play for several months on the Criterion channel as part of this commemoration.
It's fantastic. And again, like when you say the Vietnamese films, these are Vietnamese films made in Vietnam, right? So
Exactly.
yeah, so
Yeah.
that's very, very important. That's very
And we're
key.
going back to like the 60s and 70s during
Yeah.
wartime. And some of these films, I'm not choosing these films because they're like the best made films in the world and like that. Look, it's not that. The Vietnamese industry at the time, was obviously very it was underdeveloped. And a lot of these films, obviously, films. I say this to my students all the time, and I prep them to give them context. These films to make films, especially at that time in celluloid, it's very expensive. So for the government to approve, the resources to make these films, there's always, a hint of propaganda in there. But that's
Sure.
interesting to me, right? To
It's
see
absolutely.
what,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like you take, so it's,
Look, it's no different from
what
like Top Gun or Rambo being propaganda. It's like it's like
exactly. I teach Rambo in my class,
yeah, yeah,
in my class. So,
yeah,
and why we went from Deer Hunter to Coming Home to Apocalypse Now to Rambo to Platoon. There's different, there's different
sure.
reasons why that happened in America, and there's different reasons why these films in Vietnam were made to serve different purposes, different time periods. So that's interesting to unpack as well. But the most important thing is that we get the perspective and the point of view of people who are normally overlooked, at least in the Western America, right? The point of view of the Vietnamese in this conflict are rarely seen and heard in America, especially from the point of view of filmmaking and storytelling. So I'm excited about this project.
I'm excited about this too. So it's going to be on the Criterion Channel in April, right? So that's
Yeah.
apropos to do that. So again, Tony, what you're doing is amazing work, and I really appreciate what everything you do. And this is
I
a
want
great
to add one
conversation.
last thing.
Okay,
This
go
is
ahead.
important uh, uh, for the work that we're doing at Columbia and Weatherhead. Again, because I'm a storyteller, filmmaker, it's incredibly important to me. And I am obviously here at Columbia right now, and what I witness is just even though we've come a long way, and there's a lot more um, uh, filmmakers in Vietnam or Vietnamese Americans here, and we're telling our stories. We still have um, the road is still long. We have a lot more work to do. And one of the things we're trying to do here at the Weatherhead, and while I'm here at Columbia, is to try to get more Vietnamese stories told, get more Vietnamese films made, and um, um, bring more attention to the region in Vietnam. Because in terms of filmmaking, Japan, Korea, obviously, China, very dominant. Vietnam, not so much. So what we're trying to do is lift up the storytelling filmmaking of Southeast Asia, and in particular Vietnam as well. And that's something that we are investing a lot of time and energy this past year and also this year to try to do that. We did a series of programming, and which you helped me, Anderson, to locate some of these filmmakers across the summertime, where we called, I called it Conversations in Storytelling, Regional Voices, Global Impact, where, I went to Hanoi, I went to Saigon, I went to Singapore, Hong Kong, Beijing, and met with the top filmmakers of each of these regions, and of different generations, and spoke to them about, how they saw filmmaking, how they saw their place as storytellers, and their roles as, in this field, this medium, and their contributions, and what they think can be done, and needs to be done to bring the regional filmmaking that they're a part of forward for this next few years. And it was an eye-opening experience, because each region is different, different needs, and different forces in conflict at play. But what was common about all this was just incredible, deep, important desire to tell the stories and tell their own stories of their own regions. And one of the difficulties that I found is, how do you do that to be authentic as possible, but also have an impact beyond just your region, right? You make a film about your region, of course, people in that region, will see it, understand it. But how do you do it in a way where you can have that personal, authenticity, but still have it play out in the world and have that global impact to make a difference? And that's something that's one of the challenges that we are and dealing with, and trying to do our part to help.
Yeah, I mean, again, Asia's not a monolith. Storytelling is
Yeah.
universal, and also
Yeah.
the tenets of storytelling are universal. That's striking that balance. I think we all have
Yeah.
shared experiences that are very, very, that
Yeah.
are kind of that shorthand that we get it, even though I'm not from that culture, but I get it. So
Yeah.
so that's very powerful. But again, thank you, Tony.
And yeah,
Yeah,
and by the way, storytelling and filmmaking, the arts, and soft power, right? We talk about regions
both
and
are
worlds,
part.
and all
Yeah,
its politics, economics, stuff like that. But the arts and soft power is incredibly important. You want to move, and change hearts and minds. the arts. I'm telling you, yeah, that's where we need to invest in.
Yeah, no, film again, film is the most powerful medium. So, in all of its like aspects and whatnot. So again, Tony, thank you very much, man.
Thanks, Anderson.
Fount of like a lot of info, and but like what you're doing is great work, and I'm glad that you're helping shape the minds of the next generation of filmmakers as well. So, thanks, man.
Thank
So,
you.
and then again, I'm really looking forward to seeing your curated work on the Criterion Channel this April.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I'll keep you updated as we go along.
Yes,
Thanks,
absolutely.
Anderson. All right,
We'll
thanks for
also
having
add
me.
links
Okay.
to to this conversation on when it's on, if you see on Spotify or on
Oh yeah,
YouTube.
perfect.
We'll add a bunch of links as
Yeah.
well for people to delve more into what your work and et cetera, et cetera. So thanks again.
Okay.
And then and we'll see you, audience. We'll see you, or not see you. We'll see you or hear you. You'll hear us in the next episode. So thanks very much.